Hello, everybody, and welcome to the live stream. My name is Joe Palmetto, Joe the Lawyer, here today to talk about really anything that the audience wants to chat about. I have some new thoughts on the Nick Reiner case that I will probably go into. But if there are other things that anybody wanted to chat about, I'd be happy to engage in them as well. Give me a second here while I pull up my chat. Looks like we got it. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Joe Palmetto, Joe the Lawyer. I'm a practicing Pittsburgh criminal defense lawyer. I've been doing this for 10 plus years. I'm also a veteran of the United States military. I got a JD, Juris Doctor from Duquesne University School of Law, and my undergrad is in political science from University of Pittsburgh. If you like my channel, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. I'd love to get more subscribers, more views, more attention drawn to the channel, and those are free ways to support the channel. And also, before we start, and this Coke Zero goes out to Scott Adams right now, who appears to have terminal cancer. The author of Dilbert, somebody that I've followed fairly closely over the years. She's just got great advice on a lot of different things. Okay, so grab your cup, your glass, raise it in the air, sip with me. It tastes better when we sip together. We got Santa Claus on the Coke bottle. Cheers. Okay, not too bad. That was pretty good. All right, so in my last video, I spoke about the Nick Reiner case and how I thought he has a decent insanity defense, and I think he even has a pretty good temporary insanity defense. And there were some questions in the comments. An insanity defense, if he is found guilty but insane, so that's how the verdict would more or less be stated: guilty but insane, and this is true of most states, then Mr. Reiner, if he's found guilty but insane, he would go to a mental hospital probably for the rest of his life. I don't know exactly how California works, but that's how a guilty but insane verdict works. The person, instead of going to jail or prison the rest of your life, and most guilty verdicts for first degree homicide, I don't know every state, but in Pennsylvania, if you're guilty of first degree homicide, which is first degree murder with malice, premeditated murder, then you will go to jail for the rest of your life. It's a mandatory life sentence. And so if you are found guilty but insane, you will still get a mandatory life sentence, but you will be committed to a mental hospital instead of going to a state prison, state correctional facility. So that's preferable for a lot of people. And I do think in some states you can be paroled if you get guilty but insane for various factors, if you're rehabilitated, etc. Now, the other defense that I talked about, it is a controversial defense, but it's been around in American law for a long time, is temporary insanity. And temporary insanity is where a person is not like always insane, right? Like a person who is always insane will be guilty but insane. But a temporary insanity defense is a defense where a person, instead of they're always quote unquote insane, they have a temporary phase of insanity, and during that temporary phase is when they commit the crime. And if the crime is committed within this temporary state, this temporary period of time, then the person is found not guilty and they will walk free as long as that insanity has ended. It has ended, right? Like a doctor says you're no longer insane, and you were only insane because you were off your medication for 3 days, and during those 3 days you went on this crime spree. But when you're on your medication all the rest of the time, you're okay, and when you're on your medication afterwards, you're okay. And the person can go free with temporary insanity. And so it's a wild defense, but it's extremely, if you're a defense lawyer, right, where you're just trying to get the best result possible, or you're the person accused of the crime, that's a fantastic way for a case to be resolved, although it may leave taxpayers, voters, and district attorneys very upset with a jury who does that. So that's temporary insanity and insanity. And I wanted to speak about one more option that Nick Reiner would have. There's one more option he would have that I didn't speak about before, and that is the defense of diminished capacity. And so insanity and temporary insanity essentially if a jury is to find that somebody is insane, they must conclude that that person did not have the ability to distinguish between right or wrong or understand the actions that they were taking. There is one additional defense that would be available to Nick Reiner. It's one step down from this, right? You have insanity, temporary insanity. One step down. It is called diminished capacity. And I'm going to read straight from this Cornell Law School definition. Diminished capacity plea is based on the belief that certain people, because of mental impairment or disease, are simply incapable of reaching the mental state required to commit a particular crime. In the example of murder and manslaughter, a diminished capacity defense contends that a certain defendant is incapable of intending to cause a death and therefore must have at most caused such a death recklessly. Thus, a successful plea of diminished capacity in a murder trial would likely result in the charge being reduced to manslaughter. So, under Pennsylvania law, it's stated a little bit differently, but that captures the gist of it. I'm a Pennsylvania lawyer, so that's my frame of reference. You have to, in order to kill first degree murder, you must have specific intent. You must have the specific intent, which means you knew and you wanted to kill that person. So that's what specific intent means. You formed the ability to have the intent to kill that person. Well, a diminished capacity defense, and if there's any viewers, if anybody wants to chime in, talk, let me know what subjects you want to chat about. I'm happy to chat. But a diminished capacity is kind of like a step down from insanity, because insanity says you had no clue, no ability to understand what you were doing. But diminished capacity says, well, you may understood what you were doing, but you couldn't form the specific intent to commit that crime. And what diminished capacity does is it reduces first degree homicide to a degree of homicide that doesn't carry the same level of intent, right? Specific intent, which is the highest level of intent and is required in a first degree homicide, means when you did something, if you stab somebody or you hit them with a car, you meant to kill them. You did it because you wanted to kill them. That's first degree homicide, specific intent, guilty, life in prison. But if you were under the influence of a mental illness, a specific mental illness, and you committed the crime, you may not have intended to kill them, but what you did was reckless, and reckless is a lower state of mind, right? Specific intent is, I knew what I was doing and I wanted to do it. Recklessness is, well, I did something that I shouldn't have done. I violated a duty to not do something that was really, really dumb and stupid, but I didn't mean to kill them. And what diminished capacity will do is if the jury decides or a judge that your capacity was diminished, you cannot be found guilty of specific intent, and instead you are found guilty of a crime that carries a lesser degree of intent. And right below specific intent, you have recklessness. So specific intent to do something, then you kind of have recklessness, then you have negligence. And recklessness in some states will get you like a third degree homicide, or manslaughter, which would generally take you out of the life sentence. You're no longer going to face the mandatory life sentence. You may get 10 to 20 years. Other states, you may even get less. So Nick's going to have all those options in order to mount his defense. And those are a lot of options to talk for the lawyer to use, right? It's going to give his lawyer more tools in the tool set, right? He can argue insanity. He can argue temporary insanity. He can argue diminished capacity. And meanwhile, the prosecution is just going to be saying, first degree murder, find him guilty, specific intent, meant to do it, blah, blah, blah. Well, the defense lawyer is going to give him 3 options. And in a lot of juries, I said this in my last video, they like to quote unquote split the baby. They like, oh, well, they like the defense, and we'll give the defense something, and we'll also give the prosecution something. Like, we're going to find him guilty, but we're going to apply that diminished capacity so he doesn't go to jail the rest of his life, but he'll go to jail for 10, 15, 20 years. And I also think, a lot of people have been watching on YouTube, they think this Reiner case is open and shut. And I don't think he's necessarily going to avoid a conviction of some sort, but I do think that with this diminished capacity in play and the insanity defenses, I think he's going to have a good chance to fight this case. So, we will see kind of how it plays out. It's probably a case that I'm going to follow pretty closely, but I don't think he's dead in the water. And never underestimate a really creative and or wily attorney, or one that has a lot of experience and knowledge. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that Reiner case plays out. I'm doing a live stream because I want to see what people want to talk about. Everybody is talking about this Maduro thing. This is basically a law-based channel. I do have one thing. I do have actually a few things to say about this Maduro thing and how it applies to the law, because this is a law-based channel. So, in law school, your first year, you do a lot of mandatory classes, and then your second year you get some electives, and your third year is almost all electives. And one of the classes I took that looking back was not really that functional, okay, for my legal career, was international law. And it's been essentially useless in my career, and it's useless for most lawyers unless they actually deal with companies, corporations in other countries. They deal with maybe immigration. It can be helpful. You deal with, or you work for a government entity that deals with other countries, right? That's where international law comes in. And so if you roll around Twitter a little bit, X, you look at some of the chatter about the killing, the kidnapping, I don't know what you call it, the abduction of Nicolas Maduro, and him being brought to the United States to stand trial. And there's all these people that are like, oh, it's a violation of international law. It's a violation of international law. But what you need to understand is the law in a country like the United States. See, the United States has laws, right? Great Britain has laws, France has laws, Japan has laws, Indonesia has laws. But they also have the laws, right, don't have that much meaning if you don't have the structure to enforce those laws, right? Laws mean nothing if they are not enforceable. And on the global scale, you talk about the United Nations, okay? The United Nations can do things when they vote and they act together, but if they can't act together, they can't do anything. And most of the time, they can't agree on anything that actually leads to very solid action, right? It's just kind of this political entity that will sets precedent or positions of different countries, etc., and it works to bring people together. But the United Nations can't enforce international law. There's no United Nations police force. There's no United Nations military. Okay. So there is in essentially in Belgium, The Hague, you have, there's an international criminal court, right? The ICC. And there's also something like, I can't remember exactly what it's called, an international civil court. And the ICC and the International Civil Court out there, they don't have enforcement power. They don't have the ability, like they do have. My understanding is they do have these laws. Okay, there's a body of laws that the International Criminal Court will follow, but they can't enforce it on their own, and they don't belong to a country that can enforce it, and the United Nations can't enforce it. Now, occasionally, example with the International Criminal Court, individual countries may enforce it, right? So International Criminal Court can issue an order for somebody to be arrested, but if if one of those countries that wants to play along with the court, essentially, if they can't enforce that, arrest warrant's meaningless. It's totally meaningless. And so if you see in the International Criminal Court, you'll see oftentimes the world leaders who are prosecuted and held to accountability in the International Criminal Court are from the poorest countries in the world. The countries have no means of defending themselves. I do think the International Criminal Court has like issued some sort of warrant for the arrest of Vladimir Putin, okay, or something along those lines, and it has had an effect because some of those countries, they threaten, they're like, if Putin steps foot in this country, like, we'll arrest you and take you to the International Criminal Court. So it has an impact, but Putin can just decide not to go to those countries. And I believe that's what he's essentially done. Not that he was going to go there anyway because of the war, but then you have countries like the United States or China and a whole bunch of other countries that are just they're not bound by what the International Criminal Court puts out there. So the International Criminal Court, a quote unquote international law, it has some power. It does have some power and influence, but that's based entirely on member countries having the power, ability, means, and desire to enforce it. And yeah, I mean, if you have a court like this International Criminal Court in a country like France or Great Britain or Germany is backing it and will follow its rules, it gives it a little bit of teeth, yeah. But it's not something that just can be applied over the entire world, right? Like, I don't believe the United States is a party to that International Criminal Court, so they're not going to tell the United States to do anything. And, even if the International Criminal Court, say, issued a warrant for a United States senator or something, or a president, okay, like, who in their right mind would execute that warrant, right? Because so what talks is power. Power is what talks. Power is what matters on the international stage. The internet, there is no, the relationships between countries are it's anarchist, it's anarchical. They all deal bilaterally, individually with each other, and there's no overarching power. There are countries that are more powerful than others that gives them more influence, but there's no police force that calls the shots, makes the rules, enforces the laws. So when people go on Twitter, say violation of international law, it may be true, it's a nice thing to say, but international law is just this collection of laws that is largely ignored. And the hope is, though, that the world starts establishing some precedent so that maybe in the future international law will carry some weight. But right now, we live in a state where international law, again, is largely ignored and only applied to the weakest, most outcast of countries. And again, the International Criminal Court, if you look on who they've actually prosecuted or, successfully brought before their tribunal, it's essentially leaders from the poorest countries in the world. Africa. I think almost every person that's been brought before the International Criminal Court is African, I think. And what happens is, like, these European countries will somehow, or somebody will get these bad leaders into custody, and then bring them before the International Court. But those countries that kind of take these people into custody, they could have just prosecuted these people themselves if they really wanted to. Let me see if we can look up individuals who've actually been prosecuted in the International Criminal Court. Individuals prosecuted in international, because I don't think there's been that many, but there have been more. So here you go. Excuse me. Here's a list. This is a list of people who have been indicted. So it's a pretty long list. But how many of them were actually prosecuted? So you have Joseph Kony at the top here. Fugitive. He was an African warlord. Luquia, proceedings terminated, died, serving sentence. So here's one, Dominic Ongwen. So this person actually was detained in 2014, 2021. The ICC convicted him of war crimes. But where's he from? Uganda. Again, it's these countries. And generally what will happen is another country or people in that country themselves will capture this person and then take them to the International Criminal Court, right? Like the International Criminal Court, like they don't have their own way to enforce these laws. They don't have the ability to do that. So again, when people are like, clear violations of international law, it's like, what, like, what is international law? There are a set of laws out there that are written, a set of conventions and accords and things like that, but there's no force to actually really enforce it in a fair, even-handed way across the whole planet. And we could take this a step deeper. There's globalists who want to enforce something like that, want to create a world where there is a global police force or something along those lines. I don't think we're anywhere near that, but I think that some people give that a lot of serious thought. There's two other areas of international law that I think are worth talking about. One is treaties, right? Like if a country, so for the United States, for example, to become a party to a treaty, it has to be passed through Congress. It may only have to go through the Senate. I can't recall exactly, but it has to be passed. A treaty with another country has to be passed through Congress and signed by the president. And then the treaty actually becomes enforceable law within the United States. So it's almost like when you make these treaties, when a treaty is signed, then the United States, by its own domestic law, is bound to follow that treaty. And it can lead to certain things, right? Like if you have an agreement where diplomats from Saudi Arabia come to the United States and commit a crime, they can't be arrested, right? Diplomatic immunity from Top Gun, from Lethal Weapon. I have diplomatic immunity. Those sorts of things are generally in treaties. What happens is a country will decide that the treaty becomes part of their own domestic law. In the United States, it goes through Congress, and it's very serious when it's applied. So treaties are sort of a form of international law. Generally don't apply to like every country, but sometimes they sort of do, because they're very broad, or they try to lay out these rules for war. But again, like if these rules for war are broken, what are the consequences? There's other global organizations like the World Trade Organization, and I think there's even an international civil court at The Hague, where countries will take disputes such as over territory and fishing waters, over certain trade rights or tariffs or things like that. and they decide through consent, the two countries consent. I think Great Britain and it was either Iceland or Norway had a long-standing battle over fishing rights in the North Sea, and they decided, and they were like, it would like turn into fishing warfare where these boats would collide and people were killed, and I think they took these disputes to that international civil court, but that was through consent. So both countries said, you know what, we'll let this court decide. It's a good way to decide. So they agreed to it and then submitted the case. And then the decision, whether or not the decision of the court is binding, again, depends on the action of the two parties. Kind of just like a treaty. So that sort of sums up international law, right? Like you do have these things like the Geneva Convention and these laws that the International Criminal Court will apply, but whether or not they're applied depends entirely on whether or not the individuals are taken into custody by some other party and then brought to The Hague, brought to Belgium. And then once they're there, yeah, the International Criminal Court has some jurisdiction. But nobody will ever realistically, in my opinion, maybe this may change at some point. And, you know, the thing with Vladimir Putin is he's made so many enemies with this war in Ukraine that there likely are countries that would be willing to enforce this International Criminal Court warrant against him, okay? Because he's so many countries in Europe are threatened by him. Outside of Europe, though, largely these, you know, nobody's going to enforce these edicts from the International Criminal Court. But it only has power if a party gives it power, takes the individuals into custody and brings them before the International Criminal Court. And what's happened so far in history, again, you could tell from this list, most of these people, Kony, Luquia, Ongwen, are from Africa or from otherwise poor countries. See, they got down here. Here you go. March of 2013 and 2023, Vladimir Putin's considered a fugitive from the International Criminal Court. Again, they'll just never realistically be able to enforce that. And it's like, you know, if he landed down in Poland, like, would they take him into custody and enforce this International Criminal Court thing? Yeah, probably. I don't even know if Poland's a signatory to it. But Poland would have grabbed him anyway, you know. So, like, what difference does it make? But you could see the vast majority of these individuals, if you clicked on them, they are from very small. They're from African countries and otherwise countries that can't defend themselves from these larger countries sort of bullying them. And what the ICC, International Criminal Court, is doing is they're starting to build this precedent, though, right? Like they are effectively, they have a body of work now where they've prosecuted some of these individuals, you know, completed sentence of 11 months, appeal of sentence of 15 years in prison, Alfred Yekatom. So, you know, they do have these people that they have placed into prison. And, you know, there's cases pending. Like Duterte, there we go, from the Philippines. I don't know how he ended up in there, in the International Criminal Court. I think the Philippines themselves, the people in the Philippines arrested him and they turned him over to the International Criminal Court. So that's how that sort of thing happens generally. The court doesn't have its own sort of reach, its own police or enforcement law. And so is the United States action in Venezuela perhaps in violation of some international law? I mean, here's the other thing to remember is like there's vast bodies of international law. Almost any action can violate it. And there also are arguments probably that it wasn't violated, right? And you'd have to kind of add up all the pieces and look at all the evidence to decide if it truly was. Because the United States, at least in this instance, has some arguments against it, right? Like they, I'm sorry, not deter, Maduro had been indicted for drug trafficking in the United States. I'm sure there's evidence that he sent and moved drugs, narcotics, and weapons into the United States. So does that give the United States a casus belli, a reason, a valid reason, justification to take the military action that it did? And under international law, I don't know, right? I don't know all these laws to read, et cetera, et cetera. It might not. So very interesting way to sort of look at this. And I do think international law can be helpful and important in some senses, but it's not like this governing body. It's the United Nations is not what I think a lot of people think it is, right? It's more of just a forum for people to state their positions and sometimes create or break alliances. What matters really on the world stage, because we live in a state of anarchy, and there's a very technical political sciencey definition to that anarchy, but we live in a state of anarchy where there's no overriding power. So the power of individual countries is what's most important, and then their alliances. And the United States does something like this, nobody's really going to stop them. The ICC is not going to issue a criminal warrant for officials in the United States, right? There's been many instances since the end of World War II of democracies and non-democracies taking things into their own hands because they know France in Algeria and French Indochina, they know that there's not truly any global force that can stop them, right? You have to see what will the neighboring countries and the other world powers do. That's what you have to look at. That's probably more at this stage more important. Their reactions are more important than what international law has to say. So it's kind of better to judge what a country does more on its own individual basis than saying, oh, this is a violation of international law. Again, laws that not everybody even had a hand in creating, right? Like you want to be subject to a law. One thing about democracy, United States, is, yeah, you're subject to a law, but at least you have a say in the political process that creates those laws. Well, I promise you, like most of these African dictators, they didn't have a say in the process that created the ICC or the laws that the ICC enforces also. So in that sense, the legitimacy of it itself can be doubted. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, I'm going to try to make my live streams more regular. I'm going to try to put more notice out there so that people can tune in. If you like my content, please like, subscribe, comment, share. Joe Palmetto, Joe the Lawyer. I'm a practicing Pittsburgh criminal defense lawyer. I'm going to talk about criminal stuff, criminal cases, and anything else that my audience wants to talk about. I just wanted to hit that international law point because of what happened with Maduro today. All right, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the stream. Thank you very much, and have